So the next seam finish we're going to look at is called the flat felled seam. I'll be using the 3/4 inch seam allowance pattern. This will take care of the remaining 2 pieces of muslin that were cut for the 3/4 inch seam allowance pattern. Again, I've got 2 pieces of muslin with the 3/4 inch seam allowance marked in friction pen, and I have my notches cut at the top and the bottom of my pieces of muslin. There we go. So this seam finish, the flat felled seam, is one of 2 self-enclosed or self-encased seam finishes that we'll be doing for the sample book. A self-enclosed, self-encased seam is just as it sounds. All of the raw edges of our seam will be enclosed within the seam itself. Now, typically when you're sewing a seam on a garment, you're putting right sides together. You're taking the right sides of the fabric and placing the 2 together, so that when you open out the seam allowance is on the wrong side of the garment and the right sides of the garment are showing. But with muslin, it isn't as easily discernible where the right side and wrong side of the fabric is. Now, when you're working with printed fabrics, it's usually much easier to discern which is the right side and which is the wrong side. And as an artist, you can choose which side of the fabric you prefer to be the right and wrong side. But for muslin, although there is a right and wrong side to muslin, it's not always as easy to tell. So we're going to make that decision right now as to whether we're using the right or the wrong side of the fabric. Get yourself a nice Sharpie pen, some kind of permanent marker so that it doesn't disappear, and determine which sides of the fabric you prefer. I'm going to go ahead and mark these 2 sides as the right sides of my fabric. What is important when you make these marks is that you have a mirrored pair of fabric of your muslin pieces. When you cut your muslin, both pieces probably look like this with the seam allowance marked on the right side of each sample. Go ahead and turn one around so you then have a mirrored pair, so that my seam allowance is marked to the right of this sample and to the left of this sample. Because again, this is typically how we would put our seams together. So with these marked, I'm going to grab my Sharpie. I'm going to label this as the right side. I'm going to go down here at the bottom of my samples and just write right side. And the same over here, right side. I'm going to take both samples and turn them over. And I'm going to mark these as my wrong sides. I'll just write above. I can clearly see where I wrote right side. I'm just going to go above that and write wrong side. And the same over here. So now I know which is the wrong side of my fabric and which is the right side of my fabric. Now again, as I mentioned, with most seams, typical seams that we've been doing up until now, we would put right sides together so that the right sides would be facing each other, and when you sew your seam, when you open this out, it looks nice and clean, and the right sides of the fabric face out. However, for this self-encased, self-enclosed seam, I instead want to put the wrong sides together. So I've got the wrong sides of my fabric, and I'm going to place those together. Now I've got my seam line marked, and if for some reason you do not have your seam line marked, you can go ahead and do so by marking a 3/4 inch seam allowance from the raw edge. That's 6 of these tiny little squares. I have my notches aligned. Make sure your notches are lining up. You shouldn't have any notches on either side. Both should be in the same location. on the top and bottom of your samples. Go ahead and pin everything in place. I'm just gonna flip my sample over. Again, the right side is facing out, right side is facing out. I'm gonna pin these because, as you know, I like to pin with all of my extra fabric going towards my left. It's entirely up to you if you want to pin it from this side or this side. Doesn't make a difference, but if you want to follow with me, just know that I flipped my sample over, and now I'm going to pin perpendicular to my stitching line. There we go. So wrong sides are together, wrong sides facing each other, right sides facing out, seam line marked, 3/4 inch seam allowance, notches are lined up, everything is pinned perpendicular to the stitching line, and I'm going to head to the machine and sew this seam. Lifting my presser foot, sliding my work underneath, lowering my foot, lowering my needle, 2 stitches forward, 2 stitches back, sewing my seam, walking my stitches as I get to the end of my seam. Then I'll take 2 stitches back and 2 stitches forward. Turning the hand wheel till my take-up lever is all the way up, lifting my foot, removing my work, clipping my threads. So, another seam, clean finish, back tack at the beginning and end. So every time I take those 2 stitches forward and back, that is referred to as a back tack. Here's my bobbin thread in white on the underside, and I'll go back to the iron and press this seam open. When you come over to the iron, I advise you to bring yourself a ruler, bring a ruler with you, and a friction pen or some kind of marking tool, and a pair of scissors, because we're going to be clipping our seam allowance and trimming it down. I'm going to press this seam open, so anytime you are asked to press a seam open, it's like opening the pages of a book. You open out both sides of the seam allowance, tug your actual garment a little bit just to make sure there's no fabric coiling up underneath itself, and press both seam allowances out flat. So pressed seam, that would be the outside of our garment. This would be the inside. Again, that's the wrong side of our garment. This is the right side. The leftmost seam allowance, take your ruler and your pen and remove 1/2 inch from this 3/4 inch seam allowance. So we're now reducing the leftmost seam allowance to 1/4 inch. I'm going to measure a 1/2 inch away from that raw edge, leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So our seam was here, and now I've made a line 1/4 inch away. You can also measure a 1/2 inch from the raw edge to right here. And I'm going to trim this seam allowance down to 1/4 inch. That's why I have my scissors handy. Again, I've pinched this leftmost seam allowance and tucked everything else out of the way, so I'm only cutting through my seam allowance. Do not cut through your garment fabric. And I'm just going to trim along that line, reducing my seam allowance to 1/4 inch. Open this back up, and now I've got lopsided seam allowances. I've got 3/4 of an inch here and 1/4 inch over here. With the rightmost seam allowance, I'm going to lift this up, move everything else out to the left-hand side and isolate this. I'm going to do the opposite over here and measure 1/4 inch in from my raw edge. So reducing my seam allowance by 1/2 inch. I'm sorry, reducing it by 1/4 inch. So I've made a little guideline for myself, 1/4 inch in from that raw edge. Now we're not going to trim anything off of this seam allowance. Instead, we're going to do something similar that we did before, and I'm now going to fold along that seam allowance. Now when we did the turned in stitch, we fold under. In this case, however, we want to fold up and over. So we're folding towards our leftmost seam allowance. So I'm going to fold along that 1/4 inch line and give it a little bit of a finger press. And when I'm happy with where that fold is, making sure that it's nice and uniform, 1/4 inch fold all the way from top to bottom, I'll press that one more time with my iron. It's also going to get rid of my friction pen marks. Now I have a 1/4 inch seam allowance on the left. I still have the 3/4 inch seam allowance on the right, but it's now been folded over. And now I'll take this rightmost seam allowance that has just been folded and fold that over my leftmost seam allowance. So I'm just lifting up underneath this folded edge and pushing it up and over on top of that reduced seam allowance that we had. So one more time, there's the leftmost seam allowance that we trimmed down to 1/4 inch, right there. And here is that 3/4 inch seam allowance. We folded it up, finger pressed it, ironed it flat, and now we're going to push that on top of our leftmost seam allowance. Again, making sure our seam is nice and clean here. You should see your stitches. It's probably going to be your stitches from your bobbin thread. And I'm going to press it one more time just to make sure all that seam allowance goes to the leftmost side. Again, this is the right side of our garment. If you have a pair of jeans, you've probably seen a seam like this on the inside of your jean, the inseam of your jeans. This would be the wrong side of the garment, clean finished on both sides, and we have no seam allowance raw edges showing. I'm now going to pin this in place. I'm pinning through all of the layers. Pinning through all the layers. And you may notice that my pins oriented to the camera are going to the left. I'm going to actually turn my work around when I get back to the sewing machine again so that I can work with my pins coming out to my right. So I'll go back to the sewing machine and we'll do the last line of stitching for our flat felled seam. Back at the sewing machine, as you notice, I've got my pins going out to my right. I pinned it in this orientation while it was on the ironing board, and you can sew it in this direction. I just like to turn my work around. If you're going to sew it from this direction, just make sure you align, because we are going to top stitch. Be sure to align this fold with the innermost edge of this foot, this toe. I am going to turn my work around so that I can pull my, I'm going to turn my work around so that I can pull my pins out from the right. And just as we did on the turned and stitched, I'm going to top stitch. The only difference with this is with the turned and stitch we were only sewing through the seam allowance, but here I'm going to sew through everything. I'm going to sew through all of my layers, and I've aligned the fold of my seam allowance that I just made on the iron with the innermost edge of this foot. Again, 2 stitches forward, 2 stitches back. Carefully remove my pins as I go and carefully top stitch along this folded edge. Lock my stitches as I get near the end of my stitch line. 2 stitches back, 2 stitches forward. Make sure my take-up lever is all the way up, lift my presser foot, remove my work, and clip my threads. And that is our flat-felled self-encased seam. And that is our flat-felled self-encased seam. This is actually a pseudo flat-felled seam. This is a type of flat-felled that you can create on any lock stitch machine or home machine. The flat-felled seams you often see on denim are made on a specialty machine, that free arm, off the arm machine that you all found in your pre-quarter assignments. I'm not going to include that in there. Okay, let me do that one over. So this is our flat-felled seam, self-encased, self-enclosed seam. This is more of a pseudo flat-felled seam. This is a seam you can create on any lock stitch or home stitching machine. An actual flat-felled seam that you might see on denim is actually made on a specialty machine. Let's take this over to the work table so we can see how it looks all together. So here is the flat-felled seam finish. This is one of the self-encased or self-enclosed seam finishes. Here it is from the right side of the sample, where you should see a line of top stitching along that folded edge, and you should see another line of stitching to the right of that. My stitching does not match because my top thread is black and my bobbin thread is white. But on an actual garment, you would be using the same color thread on top and bottom, so you would see 2 identical colors of thread from the right side. And on the wrong side, you should see the remainder of your top stitching on the right-hand side. This would be your bobbin thread from that top stitch that we just finished. And you should see a nice flat pressed seam allowance, seam, not seam allowance, a nice flat pressed seam to the left, labeled wrong side. So this would be the inside of the garment, and this would be the outside of the garment. I'm going to label this as flat-felled seam finish. And that is our next seam finish done.